Title: Inside Stony Mountain, How Gangs Shaped One of Canada's Most Violent Prisons. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins just outside Winnipeg, Manitoba, on flat prairie land where winter winds cut across open fields, stands Stony Mountain Institution. From a distance, the prison looks unremarkable. Concrete walls, guard towers, razor wire, and security lighting, features common to many federal institutions across Canada. Nothing about its exterior suggests the internal reality that would come to define its reputation. But inside those walls, Stony Mountain developed into something different. Not overnight, not by accident, and not because of a single failure. Its story is one of gradual erosion of control, shaped by gang influence, violence, drugs, and a system struggling to respond. A prison divided by allegiance. Unlike prisons where inmates mix relatively freely, Stony Mountain became a place defined by unspoken borders. These divisions were not marked on maps or official documents, but everyone inside understood them. Certain ranges, tables, and walking paths belonged to specific groups. Crossing those invisible lines could result in immediate retaliation. Correctional officers learned to read these signals. Who stood where? Who moved together? Who suddenly stopped talking? Experienced staff have said they could often sense violence coming before it happened, not through intelligence reports, but through changes in inmate behavior. The prison's social structure was shaped largely by gangs tied to Winnipeg street culture. Indigenous-based gangs such as the Indian Posse and Manitoba Warriors, along with other organized groups and independent crews, brought long-standing rivalries into a confined environment. These conflicts did not disappear at the prison gate. They intensified. 4 inmates entering Stony Mountain without affiliations. Neutrality was rarely an option. Being alone meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant becoming a target. Many joined gangs not out of loyalty but survival. Violence as a pattern, not an exception. Violence at Stony Mountain was not random. It followed patterns. A fight in the yard triggered retaliation in the ranges. A confiscated phone led to revenge later that night. A debt from the street followed someone into custody and had to be paid. Investigations and correctional reports repeatedly described cycles of violence, where one incident set off a chain reaction. These cycles made the institution unpredictable, even when it appeared calm. Weapons were officially banned, but in practice they were everywhere. Inmates fashioned blades from melted toothbrushes, scrap metal pulled from vents, broken plastic trays, or wood fragments. Almost anything could be turned into a weapon with enough time and intent. The result was one of the highest rates of inmate-on-inmate assaults and stabbings reported in Canada during certain periods. Some attacks occurred in areas designed to prevent exactly that: secure units, supervised ranges, controlled movement corridors. Each incident raised the same questions. How did the weapon get inside? How did the attack happen so fast? Where were the blind spots? The rise of no-weapon zones. In response to escalating violence, Stony Mountain implemented what became known as no-weapon zones. These were not peaceful areas. They were sections of the prison so volatile that extraordinary measures were taken to contain them. In these zones, searches were constant. Movement was tightly restricted. Everything entering the range, food trays, clothing, legal paperwork, was checked repeatedly. Officers attempted to isolate the most violent individuals and disrupt gang coordination. The zones reduced some incidents, but they were not a solution. Weapons still appeared. Attacks still happened. Gang influence adapted. As one internal report later described, these zones functioned as temporary pressure valves in an institution under sustained strain. Drugs and the loss of stability. At the same time, Stony Mountain faced a growing drug crisis. Methamphetamine and fentanyl became increasingly common inside the prison, smuggled through visitors, drones, corrupted supply chains, and internal trafficking networks. Drugs amplified everything. Paranoia increased. Debts multiplied. Aggression escalated. Conflicts that might once have ended in threats now ended in stabbings. Correctional officers often described fighting 3 battles at once: gangs, contraband, and mental instability. Each fed the other. Addiction drove violence. Violence drove segregation. Segregation intensified mental health crises. Staff under pressure. For correctional officers, working at Stony Mountain meant constant vigilance. Officers were routinely outnumbered on ranges dominated by gang-affiliated inmates. Routine tasks, counts, meal distribution, escorts, carried real risk. Over time, the toll became visible. Burnout increased. Absenteeism rose. Transfers out of Stony Mountain became more common. Some officers left corrections entirely. One officer later described the experience bluntly: "Stony Mountain didn't allow you to relax. You learned to distrust silence as much as noise." Every shift felt like it could be the one where something went wrong. National attention and a turning point. By the mid-2010s, the situation could no longer be ignored. A series of violent incidents, including multiple stabbings and a major disturbance, drew national attention. Federal investigators began examining what staff had been warning about for years. Their findings confirmed a grim reality: severe understaffing in high-risk units, widespread gang dominance, ineffective segregation strategies, a drug crisis exceeding national averages, poor communication between management and frontline staff. One internal review summarized the problem in stark terms: violence was outpacing the institution's capacity to control it. Stony Mountain was not simply experiencing disorder. It was being reshaped by it, a prison shaped by external forces. What made Stony Mountain particularly difficult to stabilize was that its problems did not originate entirely inside its walls. They reflected broader social realities: poverty, addiction, gang recruitment, and intergenerational trauma in the prairie region. When those issues intensified on the streets of Winnipeg, they intensified inside the prison. The institution became a compressed version of outside conflicts, with fewer exits and higher stakes. The meaning of control. Despite reforms, leadership changes, and increased oversight, Stony Mountain's legacy remains complex. Authority inside the prison has often depended not just on policy and uniforms, but on understanding alliances, anticipating retaliation, and managing power dynamics that shift daily. The prison is not defined solely by its violence, but by how violence reshaped its structure. Gangs became more than affiliations. They became systems of order, identity, and survival in a place where formal control struggled to keep pace. To understand Stony Mountain is to understand how a modern correctional institution can be transformed from within, not by chaos alone, but by organized influence operating inside rigid confinement. When control began to slip, violence, riots, and the breaking point, by the time Stony Mountain Institution reached the height of its crisis, the warning signs were no longer subtle. What had once been described as a tense but manageable environment began to show unmistakable symptoms of systemic instability. Violence was no longer an occasional disruption. It had become part of the institution's rhythm. For years, staff had observed the same patterns repeating themselves. A single fight would ripple outward. A stabbing would trigger retaliation. A seized phone or unpaid drug debt would lead to another assault days or weeks later. These incidents were rarely isolated. They were connected by networks of loyalty, obligation, and fear. At Stony Mountain Institution, violence came in cycles. Those who worked inside long enough learned to recognize the buildup. Inmates became quieter. Groups clustered more tightly. Requests for protective custody increased. Entire ranges felt heavier, colder, as if the air itself was charged. Stabbings that changed the narrative. The turning point came after a series of high-profile stabbings that drew national attention. Multiple inmates were attacked in separate incidents, some in areas designed to be secure. These were not spontaneous altercations. They were fast, targeted, and efficient. Investigators later noted that many of the weapons used were improvised, crafted from materials readily available inside the prison. Melted toothbrushes sharpened into points. Scrap metal stripped from vents. Plastic trays reshaped into blades. The creativity behind these weapons highlighted a troubling reality. Security measures were being outpaced by adaptation. Each incident raised urgent questions. How were weapons being hidden so effectively? How were attacks coordinated despite supervision? Why were existing controls failing to prevent repeat violence? The answers pointed back to the same core issue. Gang influence had created parallel systems of order inside the prison. Systems that operated faster and more decisively than official procedures. The riot that exposed the limits. One of the most alarming moments in Stony Mountain's recent history was a riot that erupted with startling speed. What began as a confrontation between rival groups escalated within minutes. Furniture was smashed. Fires were set. Officers were forced to withdraw as inmates seized control of parts of the range. Emergency response teams were deployed. The entire institution was placed into lockdown. When order was eventually restored, the aftermath revealed familiar patterns. Gang divisions. Retaliation, contraband, overcrowding, staffing stretched thin. For correctional leadership, the riot was a signal that containment strategies were reaching their limits. Lockdowns could pause violence, but they could not resolve its causes. Segregation could isolate individuals, but it often intensified resentment and mental health issues. Drugs as a force multiplier. As violence escalated, drugs played an increasingly central role. Methamphetamine and fentanyl became deeply embedded in the prison's underground economy. Phones were smuggled in to coordinate deals. Debts accumulated. Enforcement followed. Drugs did not simply coexist with gang violence, they amplified it. Inmates under the influence became unpredictable. Withdrawal intensified paranoia and aggression. Conflicts that might once have ended with intimidation now ended with stabbings. Investigators later described Stony Mountain as operating under a volatile mix of gang rivalry and substance dependency. Each reinforced the other. Gangs controlled distribution. Drugs fueled dependence. Dependence drove obedience. Officers caught in the middle. For correctional officers, the environment became increasingly dangerous. Many reported feeling outnumbered on ranges dominated by gang-affiliated inmates. Routine tasks carried heightened risk. Escorts required careful planning. Even meal distribution could become a flashpoint. The psychological toll was severe. Constant vigilance left little room for recovery between shifts. Officers learned to read body language, tone, and silence as warning signs. Burnout became common. Absenteeism rose. Transfers out of Stony Mountain increased year after year. Some officers described the experience as survival rather than enforcement. The sense of authority traditionally associated with corrections was replaced by risk management, preventing the next incident rather than maintaining order. Lockdowns and their consequences. As violence intensified, lockdowns became more frequent. Entire units were confined to their cells for days or weeks at a time. Programs were suspended. Work assignments halted. Recreation yards emptied. For inmates, these lockdowns deepened frustration and isolation. For those already struggling with addiction or mental health issues, confinement exacerbated symptoms. Medical staff reported increases in anxiety, depression, and self-harm during prolonged lockdown periods. A correctional psychologist later described the institution as a closed ecosystem where violence had become normalized behavior. In such an environment, tension did not dissipate, it accumulated. Investigations confirmed the crisis. Eventually, federal investigators and oversight bodies turned sustained attention toward Stony Mountain. Their findings echoed what frontline staff had been reporting for years. Reports cited severe understaffing in high-risk units, poor communication between management and officers, inconsistent discipline, ineffective segregation strategies, and a drug crisis surpassing national averages. One review concluded bluntly that the institution lacked the organizational stability required to control its inmate population. These findings did not describe a single failure. They described a system under prolonged strain, bending under the weight of forces it could no longer fully contain. Attempts at reform. In response, authorities initiated a series of reforms. Leadership changes were made. Hiring efforts increased. Specialized training for gang management was introduced. Security equipment was upgraded. Intelligence gathering was expanded. Searches became more frequent and more targeted. Some units stabilized. Certain conflicts cooled. The flow of contraband slowed, though it never stopped entirely. Violence decreased in some areas while persisting in others. What became clear, however, was that reform could not erase years of entrenched dynamics overnight. Gangs that had operated unchecked for long periods did not simply dissolve. Trust between staff and inmates remained fragile. A prison at the edge. By the end of this period, Stony Mountain stood at a critical point. The institution had not collapsed, but it had been fundamentally changed. Control was no longer assumed. It had to be constantly asserted, negotiated, and defended. The question facing correctional leaders was no longer whether Stony Mountain had a gang problem. That was undeniable. The question was whether the system could regain lasting control, or whether the institution would continue operating on the edge of instability. After the breaking point, reform, resistance, and the reality that remains. When Stony Mountain Institution emerged from its most violent period, it did not do so transformed overnight. There was no single reform that restored order, no announcement that suddenly erased years of instability. Instead, the prison entered a long phase of containment, adjustment, and uneasy recalibration, shaped as much by what could not be fixed as by what could. For correctional leaders, the priority was no longer perfection. It was survival of the institution itself, the push to reassert control. Following federal investigations and internal reviews, Stony Mountain underwent a series of reforms intended to stabilize daily operations. Leadership changes were among the first steps. New administrators were tasked with restoring consistency, improving communication with frontline staff, and implementing intelligence-led approaches to managing gang activity. Hiring efforts were expanded to address chronic understaffing, particularly in high-risk units. Officers received additional training focused on gang identification, conflict de-escalation, and contraband detection. Search protocols were tightened. Intelligence gathering became more systematic, relying on patterns rather than reactive responses. These changes produced measurable effects. Some of the most volatile units saw reductions in open violence. Certain gang conflicts cooled as leadership structures inside the prison shifted. The most visible outbreaks became less frequent. But stability came at a cost. A prison defined by restrictions. As violence declined in some areas, restrictions increased across others. Lockdowns remained a common tool. Movement was carefully controlled. Programs were slower to resume. Segregation, though controversial, continued to be used as a management strategy for high-risk individuals. For inmates, this meant a prison life marked by uncertainty and confinement, even during periods of relative calm. Progress was fragile. One incident could reset weeks of stability. For staff, the reforms reduced chaos but did not eliminate danger. Officers still entered ranges where gang affiliations dictated social order. Authority remained conditional, respected in moments, tested in others. The limits of enforcement. What became increasingly clear was that enforcement alone could not dismantle the structures that had formed inside Stony Mountain. Gangs had embedded themselves deeply into the prison's social fabric. They controlled access to protection, drugs, and informal economies. They offered identity in an environment where individuality was stripped away. Efforts to disrupt these networks often displaced rather than destroyed them. When leaders were transferred or segregated, others filled the void. When drugs were intercepted, prices rose and violence followed. Correctional reports acknowledged this reality indirectly. Control could be asserted temporarily, but influence was harder to erase. The prison had become a reflection of the external conditions that fed it: poverty, addiction, gang recruitment, and systemic inequality. The human cost. Behind every statistic were individuals absorbing the consequences of prolonged instability. Inmates lived with constant tension, knowing that allegiance often mattered more than personal history. Neutrality remained dangerous. Trust was rare. Mental health services struggled to keep pace with demand. Anxiety, paranoia, and depression were common. Extended lockdowns deepened isolation. For some, self-harm became a response to an environment that offered few outlets for control. Correctional officers carried their own burdens. Many described the emotional toll of working in a place where violence felt inevitable. Hypervigilance followed them home. Sleep suffered. Relationships strained. Some left corrections entirely, convinced that the system could not protect those tasked with enforcing it. A reputation that endures. Even as reforms took effect, Stony Mountain's reputation proved difficult to escape. Among inmates across Canada, the prison was spoken of with caution. Transfers in were feared. Transfers out were seen as relief. Among officers, the institution became known as a place that demanded experience and resilience. New staff were warned to listen more than they spoke, to observe before acting, and to respect the invisible rules that governed daily life. Public perception shifted more slowly. Media coverage faded as violence declined, but the underlying narrative remained. Stony Mountain was no longer simply a prison. It was a symbol of how quickly control could erode when systems lagged behind reality. What Stony Mountain reveals about the system. The story of Stony Mountain is not just about one institution. It is about the limits of incarceration as a solution to deeply rooted social problems. Prisons are designed to contain individuals, not to resolve the conditions that produce crime. When gang culture, addiction, and trauma are concentrated inside a confined space, they do not disappear. They reorganize. Stony Mountain demonstrated what happens when those forces outpace institutional capacity. When staffing falls short. When intelligence arrives too late. When enforcement becomes reactive rather than preventive. The prison did not fail because rules did not exist. It struggled because rules alone could not compete with organized influence operating under constant pressure. A cautious present. Today, Stony Mountain Institution continues to operate. Conditions are reported to be more controlled than during its most volatile years. Violence has not vanished, but it is more closely managed. Oversight remains active. Intelligence systems are more developed. Yet those who know the institution well speak cautiously. Stability is described as conditional. Calm is understood as temporary. The alliances that once fueled open conflict still exist, quieter but intact. One officer summarized the present reality simply: the prison is improved but never safe. A prison defined by division. Stony Mountain's legacy is not defined by its age or architecture. It is defined by division, by how allegiance shaped survival, by how violence reorganized daily life, by how authority had to adapt rather than dominate. The institution became a living map of gang territory, drawn not on paper but in movement patterns, seating arrangements, and unspoken boundaries. No fence or policy fully erased those lines. The final lesson: what Stony Mountain ultimately teaches is uncomfortable. Control inside a prison is not guaranteed by walls or uniforms. It is negotiated daily through power, perception, and pressure. Reforms can reduce violence. Leadership can improve oversight. Staffing can increase capacity. But none of these erase the deeper forces that shaped the institution's darkest years. Stony Mountain is not just a cautionary tale. It is a reminder that prisons do not exist apart from society. They absorb its conflicts, magnify its inequalities, and reflect its failures back in concentrated form. And as long as those external forces remain unresolved, places like Stony Mountain will continue to exist, not merely as correctional facilities, but as battlegrounds where order is fragile and control is never absolute.